A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, our heroes fought a very boring war against a pretty boring race of aliens. I'm talking about the Yuuzhan Vong. James Luceno's The Unifying Force marks the end of the Yuuzhan Vong War, and to say that it's a bit anticlimactic, that would be an understatement. The book is alright as far as sci-fi novels go, but it has a lot of problems and it leaves a lot to be desired. In honor of Star Wars Episode 8, I came up with 8 problems that I had with the book, and I found supporting evidence within the text to back me up. Problem number 1 is that Wedge Antilles is really important. Like, more important than I ever remember him being in any of the films. Problem number 2 is that characterization is really weird in this book. None of the characters really act like themselves. They kind of just act like trope versions of themselves. Like the author sort of knew what these characters were supposed to act like, and he kind of just went with that and made what we have in this book. Problem number 3 is that this book reads like a really bad fan fiction. Problem number 4 is that I found that this book is kind of inaccessible to new fans. Problem number 5, the dialogue is just awful. Problem number 6, the Yuuzhan Vong really aren't that interesting. Problem number 7, the sci-fi jargon is really off-putting. Problem number 8, starfighter fights do not translate well to text. Let's start with what I found most jarring about this book, and it's the fact that Wedge Antilles is suddenly like the most important person in the galaxy. So I picked up this book from my local library, and I made some notes. On page 277 of the Unifying Force, it's revealed that Wedge Antilles is now a general, which is a much higher rank than I ever assumed this minor character from the films would achieve. On page 305 of the Unifying Force, members of the Smuggler's Alliance ask for a good word to be put in with them with Wedge Antilles, which, again, why do people seem to care so much what Wedge Antilles thinks of them? Chapter 33 of this book starts with Wedge's point of view. Wedge Antilles is suddenly best friends with all of our heroes. His nephew is dating the daughter of Han and Leia, and he's like one of the best pilots around. It's a little bit much. You've ended a reign of evil, General Antilles, Foradel was saying from the Hallowfield. You should be proud. Well, that's a lot of success to put on one man, especially a man who, wasn't a main character in the movies. At Borlias, when Wedge himself had formed the secret resistance group known as the Insiders, he had essentially made a pact with the Force and felt duty-bound to uphold it. "Wedge," Lando said around a broad grin, "how much grease did it take to get you installed in that snub fighter?" Wedge is getting a lot of attention. The second problem that I had with this book is that the characterization was really weird. The characters in this book don't act like they do in the films. They act really weird and hollow. Leia and Han are probably the most damaged by this fact. Their characterization is completely all over the place. They're older now, and they've fought in many wars and battles up to this point. They've had 3 children. They've lost 1 son to war. And yet, their dialogue and their characterization is so childlike and immature at times. Here's a quote from page 178 of just their interaction. "For the 4th and final micro-jump that would deliver them at last to Mon Calamari, Han and Leia had sealed off the cockpit and spent the entire time in each other's arms. Leia on Han's lap in the pilot's chair, her arms around his neck. By the time the Falcon reverted to real space, Han was delirious, and Leia felt that, as safe corners went, the cockpit wasn't too shabby, at least until they happened on the real thing." That doesn't feel like Leia to me, and maybe this is because I'm going off of the characterization of Leia and Han in Episode 7, but this is not how I imagine an adult Leia and Han acting. Leia is really emotional in this book, which is fair, they're fighting a war. It's just that none of the other characters seem to show the same amount of emotion that she does. Leia breaks down into tears on page 294 at the thought of a safe place for them and their family. She cried softly against Han's shoulder, and when she looked up into his face, she saw tears in his eyes. "I feel like we're coming to the end of a long voyage, Han, and I hate the fact that additional violence is the only thing that's going to get us there. It's like a final payment we have to make to conclude this thing, and to ensure that our children and our children's children don't grow up with the threats we've been forced to face at every turn." The third problem I have with this book is that it reads like a very bad fan fiction. Like the epilogue to any young adult novel, Everyone in this book is married. Han is married, Leia is married, Luke is married, Lando's married. I wouldn't be surprised if Boba Fett ended up being married in a later book. Han and Leia have 3 children, 2 sons and 1 daughter. They're all Force sensitive, they're all Jedi. By the time the Unifying Force begins, Anakin Solo is already dead. But Jaina and Jace Solo are still alive and kicking. Jaina is one of the best pilots in the galaxy. Jacen is sort of into the Force. He has this thing called the Vong Sense, which is a Force-like power that allows him to sense the Yuuzhan Vong. The thing about these characters is that they're not overly perfect, they just have a lot going on. Not only is Jaina the daughter of 2 of the main characters from the movies, but she's also one of the best pilots. She's a Jedi. She was at one point considered a god of the Yuuzhan Vong. She's the official sword of the Jedi, which I don't know what that is, and Jaina doesn't seem to know what that is. So it just seems like a superfluous title that they threw on to make her even more special. If someone were to write a fan fiction with a character like Jaina, people would immediately comment on the fact that she seems kind of like a Mary Sue. Not in the fact that she's perfect, just in the fact that she plays such a large role and she has so many extra details about her. Oh, and Chewbacca's dead, which, for someone who hasn't read all of the books leading up to the Unifying Force, came as a shock. It's also mentioned super offhandedly the first time it's brought up. It's really casual, and I get that this death happened in books prior, but books should be able to be picked up and read no matter whether the reader has read previous books in the series or not. And things like that probably should have weight to them when they're mentioned, especially because Chewbacca is such a beloved character from the films. Did I mention how weird it is that Jaina was at one point considered a trickster god by the Yuuzhan Vong? That's just so extra. That is too much for one character to have. Jacen being one of the only ones with this Vong sense is another thing. Like, we get it. You're the son of Han and Leia. You're the grandson of Anakin Skywalker. It's just too much. Boba Fett is still around, which is weird because as a fan of Star Wars who's only seen the movies up until this point, I was almost positive that Boba Fett died on Tatooine, but I guess he didn't. Wedge Antilles has a nephew named Jagged Fell, and I know it's like a Star Wars name, and they all have kind of weird, ridiculous names, but that's just really fan-fiction-y too. Leia picked up the nickname Lady Vader at some point, which, again, is something I would expect from fan-fiction, not a previously canon work of Star Wars literature. I find it really hard to believe that Leia would be okay with this nickname. I got the impression that her true parentage is not only not common knowledge, but it's something that she would probably grapple with for a little bit. Leia was raised by the Organas, and she considers them her true parents. And I don't see her being okay with people just casually calling her Lady Vader, especially because Darth Vader caused so much hardship and death throughout the galaxy. It just seems really insensitive, and it seemed like just a way for the author to bring up the fact that Leia is Darth Vader's daughter. I don't see any character thinking this is okay. I don't see Leia saying this is okay. I don't understand why anyone would want to call her this. On page 147, it's mentioned that Boba Fett is alive again, and he saves Han's life, and everyone talks about what a cool guy he is, because this book is basically fanfiction. Here's a Jaina quote from page 314. "Yeah, well, neither am I. I'm just the official sword of the Jedi, whatever that means." She fell silent for a moment, then said, "Jacen, did the Yuuzhan Vong pose a threat to the Force?" How are you going to casually drop your superfluous title and then ask a completely unrelated question? This is my Star Wars OC. He's the son of Luke and Lobaka, and he is a Jedi, of course, but he's also the best star pilot ever, and people call him Lord Vader Jr., and also his official title is the Twin Blades of the Jedi, and he has a new power that allows him to sense aliens from the future, called the Future Alien Sense. That's what these characters sound like sometime. If you were to take these characters and their descriptions and put them into a fan fiction, they would not be received well. So I find it really hard to stomach the fact that these books, just because they were canon at some point, are deemed acceptable. The dialogue in this book leaves a lot to be desired, and it kind of goes back to the characterization point, where I feel like the author sort of knew what these characters were like, and he sort of knew what they would say in these situations, but it's as if he took the few minor quips that these characters had in the films and just dialed it up to 11 and made that their entire personality. Han calls C-3PO Goldenrod, and I'm not sure if he ever calls him that in the films, but if he does, it doesn't make the nickname any less ridiculous. So at one point, Jaina is having a conversation with her love interest, Jagged Fell, and he's trying to convince her that her family's okay. Here's the quote from page 155. Jag firmed his lips. "I'm certain that all of them are fine," to which Jaina responds, "How are you certain? Or is that just something people say when they don't know what else to say?" I feel like that's just a normal thing that people say to each other when they're trying to comfort others, and it doesn't need to be an entire discussion. It goes on to be a conversation on Force theology, which is weird. Jaina's insensitive, Jag is confused. It's a lot. Here's an exchange from page 143 between Leia and Han. Drawing deeper into the station, Leia was glancing over her shoulder as she approached a corridor intersection with Han, suddenly throwing his left arm around her waist and twirled her off to one side. From the scarlet glow of the intersecting corridor dropped an amphistaff, thick as a war club, slicing the air where she would have been, and hitting the deck with a hollow thud. The warrior attached to the amphistaff howled and sprang forward, falling victim to a precisely placed bolt from Han's sidearm. "You do care after all," Leia said, around a short-lived grin, still in his one-armed embrace. She went up on her toes to kiss him on the cheek. Han smiled and let her go. What's a star without his leading lady? Is now the time for any of that? And also, is any of that realistic dialogue for a war scene? Leia never really spoke like that in the movie. That was more of Han's overdramatic nonsense. But now it seems like in the past 30 or so years, he's rubbed off on her. And it doesn't make for very interesting characterization, and it makes for incredibly corny dialogue. So it's not doing anyone in this book any favors. Han put his arm around Leia and began to lead her back to the Falcon after the Jedi, Paige's commandos, and the YVH droids had moved out. At the ramp, Leia blew out her breath and looked up at him. "For our next trick." Who says that? "For our next trick." This dialogue is really bad, and it doesn't make these characters seem cool. It just kind of makes them seem like they're not taking this whole thing seriously. The sixth problem I have with this book is the Yuuzhan Vong. The Vong make for good enemies on the battlefield, but as a society and as a culture, they're a bit one-dimensional. We see a lot of their warrior cast and a lot of their religious casts, but we don't see enough of their civilian cast to really let us know what they're like as a species. It's understood that the Yuuzhan Vong are a warring race, but at the end of the book, it's brought up what should the Alliance and the Jedi do with the Yuuzhan Vong non-combatants, which leads the reader to believe that there are a lot of non-combatants among the Yuuzhan Vong. What are they like? The entire book is just characterization after characterization of the Yuuzhan Vong. They're not that interesting. They're cool in concept, though. But at the end of the day, it turns out that the Yuuzhan Vong's absence from the Force is actually a curse and not a power, which makes their species a little bit less interesting. It was kind of cool to have a race of aliens who were just absent from the Force. But it turns out that them being absent from the Force was a result of their own species' original sin, so to speak, when they turned against their peaceful ways and became a warfaring species. The seventh problem I have with this book is the sci-fi jargon. It's not really a problem, so to speak, it's just that it's really off-putting, and it kind of pulls me out of the action sometimes. Reading words like flimsyplast and ferrocrete, they're realistic enough where I know what they're trying to relate it to, but it just seems like unnecessary jargon to throw in as a form of world building. Part of a Yuuzhan Vong ship is compared to a piece of flimsyplast, which I can only assume is like saran wrap. Materials such as ferrocrete, peristeel, kelsh, and millennium are mentioned. Again, it's interesting world building, but I kind of want to know more about these substances that are being name dropped. Like, is millennium a stronger substance than transperisteel? Is ferrocrete just concrete? What is kelsh? Is that like mesh? The point is that a casual fan who were to pick up this book, or any book where these terms are just casually dropped, wouldn't know what the author is talking about. There's one part in the book where it's mentioned that there's an alien race and they have antennae, sort of like Ahsoka's alien race, and those antennae are named, and if I didn't look it up, I would have had no idea what they were talking about. I can only imagine how difficult it would have been to read this book at a time before there was a Star Wars wiki, because I had to look up a lot of terminology and descriptions of things that were mentioned, such as the Yuuzhan Vong technology. The first time amphistamps are mentioned, they're not described at all. They're described later on, but the first time they're mentioned is just, this is an amphistaff and someone used one. It's mentioned that there are combat droids that are armored in lemonanium. That's another piece of world building where they're mentioning this type of armor that they can use to make their droid stronger. But this left me with more questions than answers, because I was just wondering if lemonanium is stronger than, say, millennium. I want to know which of these substances is the strongest and which substances are weaker. And they're not going to tell me that in this book, so I kind of want them to just stop mentioning these substances. On page 369, shock ball arenas are mentioned, And then I was left wondering, what is shockball? Where is this sport played? What are the rules to shockball? It's another one of those things that I'm sure has been mentioned in other books, but again, these books are being picked up by Star Wars fans who might not have read all the previous books. The eighth problem that I have with this book is that starfighter battles do not translate well into text. Those fights are really interesting to see in movie and television because they're fast-paced and there's a lot of action. But reading that type of action that's so impersonal because these fighters are alone in these ships, and typically if they're main character, they're not taking any damage, they're simply dealing it out. It doesn't really bring the reader into a sense of excitement. Reading about Jaina or Jagged Fell, dodging almost every single enemy attack, and shooting down nameless opponents isn't really interesting. All those problems aside, I'm still a pretty big Star Wars fan, and I wanted to enjoy this book. The whole reason that I picked it up in the first place is because I was looking to expand my knowledge of the Star Wars universe. As an avid reader, I just wish this book had been better. Have you read The Unifying Force? Leave me your thoughts in the comment section below. If you're a Star Wars fan who's read some of the books, and you think there are better ones that I should read, let me know. Thanks for watching. Everyone is using the Force, but none of them are using it to do stuff we're used to. It's mostly just used as long-range telepathic instant messaging. Sometimes they don't even send thoughts. They just mentally poke each other to say hi. The Force is Jedi Facebook.